I happened to meet Andrew in Mantova, where I was giving a lecture and he was in the audience. And I think he'd also seen a lecture that I'd given just before in Colombia. But then within about a day, I think, maybe my timing is wrong, I met him in this extraordinary circular courtyard in the house of one of the painters of Mantova, whose name I've forgotten, which is shocking because he's very famous. And we spoke, and I began to see that there was an architect of some worth, having looked at his website. And I always hoped he could be on this program, and he is now. So it's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce you, Andrew, and to welcome you to the Architecture Foundation and Virtual UK. Okay, over to you.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
We can, yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much for the introduction to Ellis and the Architecture Foundation. It's been a wonderful program and a bit of interest and lift during this difficult period. We did meet at the Casa di Mantegna, a wonderful, amazing building, actually, sort of predating James Turrell by 450, 500 years. Quite amazing. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight and be able to share a little bit of work with you. I would like to start by giving you just a very brief introduction to my practice, and then end the presentation with some projects reviewed in more depth. I practice out of New York City, and I work very closely with the place, with New York City, and like to think of myself without putting limits on myself as really being a local architect. And as I've been able to practice beyond the confines of New York City, I've realized that it's more of an attitude than a name that I wish to hold on to. I started my practice about 25 years ago during one of many rolling recessions. New York City at that time was a mixture of postmodernism and very formal modernism, which was heavily annotated by theory. I started with the intention of keeping things elemental and wishing to stay very tethered to the real. There's a warehouse that I renovated for photography studios. And for this project, I very much started with a question which I continue to return to, which is what was just enough to transform an empty building, in this case, into a place of character and purpose. This is my first freestanding project. Again, decidedly elemental, working from the site, working from the local vernacular. Another early project, a renovation and an addition to a warehouse in Manhattan. Reuse, taking the found and doing something to it has been a continuous thread through my practice. Much of our work entails scrounging out new space and creating new programs from fully built out sites. This is a photograph of a garment industry building in Midtown Manhattan. And here we carved out space to create Opera America, which is the National Opera Center. It is a multi-use facility for the music and opera communities, both professionals and public. They're ensemble spaces, practice rooms, audition rooms. The main performance space was made by carving a double height volume out of the original building. And this is a view of the main performance space, again, carved out of a typical multi-story building. This is another project in which we carved out Space, in this case, it was residual space, structural space given over above a Broadway theater in Times Square. These great trusses filled the space and kind of kept the space from being used for commercial purposes, but a casting agency got a good deal on this space and asked us to create a home for them. The pressures of the real estate market have increasingly gotten difficult. It creates difficult and often strange conditions for an architect to design around, but I see it very much as a good thing. And find that everything in New York essentially comes quite encumbered. There's no blank slate, but these constraints can be leveraged into positive approaches. Another project, this is much more recent, which is a performing arts center for a resident theater company, also in Manhattan. The theater company received the raw shell at the base of 2 residential towers, and through a complicated public-private development arrangement, were allowed to build out theaters and a facility for their company. So we inserted 2 theaters. This is a view of one of them, plus the support spaces for their youth and playwright companies. The found conditions of the structural concrete were a starting point for developing a relationship with what was a non-place, but ultimately, I think, has settled into a place of its own. This is a second theater, much more flexible space. So in parallel to the civic work in the city, we do private commissions as well outside the city. It really opens up one's way of thinking to work in a more open landscape. This is a writing studio on a property that we developed into a very park-like setting. The entire thing is sheathed in copper with the daylight and the seasons. And the interior is suffused with zenithal light, and it too is animated by the changing light of the day. The building is a private world for concentration. Some of the private clients are residential, as in this case. I find it enormously liberating and enriching to be able to work on private and public at the same time, urban and rural as well. The projects all kind of cross-pollinate. This is a residence out on Long Island. It's a large house for 3 generations of a family. And obviously a project like this brings other opportunities, constraints. But one of the critical things in my practice, which we discuss all the time, is that we approach every project with the same intent and the same manner. Another private residence. This is on an island off the coast of Maine. It's about 400 miles north of New York City. A wonderful landscape and a very interesting local building culture. View of the interior. And for this project, which was on a large wooded site on the water, we were able to design a boathouse, which opens up to the water. And this is a drawing of that boathouse and in an interior view. So one of the wonderful aspects of working here was that there was craft, there was local craft, very much because there's boat building, ongoing boat building in the area. And this was one other small outbuilding for the same project. In 2018, I was invited as one of 10 architects by Francesco Dalco to contribute a chapel design to the Vatican's entry at the Venice Biennale. And while far from home, I sought to approach this project just as I approach all the others, starting first with a feel for the site and a sense of the locale. We use very modest materials and an overall general modesty of approach. I wanted to design something that was very easily constructed, something that could be moved after the Biennale to the mainland. That was a suggestion that the chapels would find a new home in places of need. There's a photo of the chapel nestled in the woods. This is on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, very close to a remarkable church by Palladio. The facade here is a porch, and the porch makes a public space. The porch has this long bench facing outward. The interior is a space for one to sit in the light, surrounded by darkness. This is a view of the light coming in through the canopy of the building, but it is not visible from inside the building. And a view from the exterior with the lagoon to the right. Earlier this year, we found that the chapels were actually protected by the Italian Ministry of Culture. They have been made permanent. They're going to remain in Venice on this site, and they're going to reopen to the public within the next couple of weeks. So now we're going to go back to New York City, again, where I live, where I work. This is a collage by Saul Lewitt. It's a collage that sort of captures some salient qualities of the city to me. And this is our studio building. We're on the 4th floor. This is downtown. It is south of Tribeca, very close to the World Trade Center. It is on a nice, gritty crosstown street. The prosaic city is very much the city of daily life, and it is absolutely the context for our practice. We're not a firm that is kind of basking in the glory of Midtown or the big commercial world. And this is a photograph by Christopher Wool taken nearby the studio in the Bowery. The beauty of the city is very much, I find, in its congestion and its sense of purpose. This is a photograph by Robert Rauschenberg taken of the rooftops in Soho. And as I've been practicing in the city, I've found that much of what really is inspirational and instructional are the fabric buildings of the city. And there's still, fortunately, many fine examples. There's a cast iron building. It's a particularly fine cast iron building. And this was Donald Judd's home and studio. So with that brief introduction, I would like to show 5 projects in more detail, one from each of the 5 boroughs of New York City. And the 5 boroughs of the city are Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Staten Island. So we're going to start in Manhattan. In 2000, I entered a design competition for the headquarters of the American Institute of Architects. It was a competition, and their brief asked for a new headquarters to be a public space, a place to show and discuss architecture, and for the profession, but also for the public at large. The site was a purchase space in Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan, which is about a 20-minute walk from my studio. The space included the ground floor of an industrial loft building. The interior of the ground floor had limited windows. And with the purchase of the ground floor came 2 lower floors below grade, which were dark, damp, and uninhabitable. For the competition entry, I made a series of physical models and montages to describe the intended spaces. I was interested in working toward an architecture that seemed inevitable, evidencing the discretion of the architect rather than the hand of the architect. Model photographs included that I included in the boards really were made not so much to show a final and fixed architecture, but to show potential of the space. I was then thinking a lot about Guatemala Clark, who had been living and working in the neighborhood before his early death. I was very intrigued by how he had created an architecture through subtraction and through framing, and how he acted upon structures, how he made without adding, and how his work revealed. And so with that thought, I approached the project here in a section showing the 3 floors, the ground floor, of course, at the top, and the street to the right, and remove sections of the concrete and the floor slabs to create double and triple height spaces. And in the process, to allow light to enter into the full depth of the space. And in this way, usable space was created where previously there had been no real space at all. The street facade was removed in an effort to create continuity between the city and the Center for Architecture. And from the street, it was possible to see all 3 levels of exhibits and the activity of the center. The exhibits in the public programming are revealed from the street and from all spaces within. The section within the plan is really responsible for giving the center order. And this is a view from the lowest level. This the space on the right is the lecture hall and workshop space. It's typically used for a lecture 2 or 3 times a day. And from this space, which was about 21 feet below the sidewalk, one can look up at the street, at the sky, and engage with the city. So our next stop is the borough of Queens. Queens is the largest borough of New York City. Manhattan, of course, is famously an island. Queens is really much more of a continent. It has the most linguistically diverse population in the world. Somewhere around 130, 140 languages are still spoken there. It's also very much a place of industry in the city, and it's culturally fertile. In Queens, we've designed 2 art spaces in a neighborhood called Long Island City. And in Long Island City, which you can see here, there's a kind of colliding of grids, and this collision of grids is very, very disorienting. And this I find personally, this disorientation is the most thing about Queens, and that's part of its magic. On the left, in red, is a new building we did for MoMA PS1, and on the right, in yellow, is the Sculpture Center. The neighborhood was very much an industrial zone. It was full of manufacturing. It was full of infrastructure for the city, rail yards. It is still very loud. There are still trains overhead. While much of the manufacturing is gone, it is still very much a kind of humming and mixed use area. So MoMA PS1 is a contemporary art facility. MoMA, of course, is the Museum of Modern Art from 53rd Street, Manhattan. MoMA and PS1 joined some years ago, and PS1 has remained focused on contemporary art. PS1 was built in 1885 as public school #1 for Long Island City. At that time, it had a large population for the manufacturing and workshops of the area. As the population thinned out, the school closed after World War II. And in the mid-1970s, Alana Heiss kind of inserted herself and some artists into the building and started slowly to colonize. We've designed 2 projects for PS1. The larger of the 2 is the renovation of the interior galleries, the art spaces, and the second is a new entry building, and converted U building at the top of the block is the former school, now museum. The arrow showing the entry into that building, and the arrow at the bottom of the screen is the entry into the site. Most of the block is bounded by walls that were designed by Frederick Fisher, who was a Santa Monica, and he created an incredible landscape, but never quite solved the condition of entry for the museum. And so we were hired to deal with the issue of entry or lack thereof. This is the site as we found it, 15-foot high concrete walls. And in blue is the location of where we located our new entry building. Here, we wish to make, of course, a place of arrival, a place where the identity of the institution was announced. And I very much wanted to work solely with the material of the site, which was the concrete. So through a very selective additive process, we created a building out of what was really there. This is a diagram to show what was there. Series of walls. To the walls, we cast concrete roof, concrete canopy, and we designed glass and steel doors to fill the gaps between the concrete walls. And here the clear elements, separate materials come together to form a whole. So the new entry experience was intended to be very much a densification of the actual qualities of the site, as well as a clear entry. And this is a photograph of the project completed. The monumental glass and steel doors were designed very much with the unique programming requirements of PS1 in mind. And the large doors can be opened up specifically for book fairs and summer music festivals, which the daily visitorship might go from 100 to 600. The natural light is the mechanism for leading one forward once entering the building. And the natural light is what animates the very austere interior. And it's a wonderfully geometric, very abstract landscape. We cited and made decisions in order to really highlight those kind of embedded qualities that were there but not fully realized. And to solve the condition of construction, we detailed a way to insert glass rods into the concrete tie holes of the concrete walls. And the rods act as transmitters of light to bring light from the outside in during the day, and at night to bring the light from the inside out. So you can see in these little points that perforate the blank concrete walls. And here are the finished project. So the building very much makes a place in front of the walls, transforming what was quite fortress-like into something that can be approached. But that said, I hope not giving away the mysteries of arrival and finding the museum beyond. So the other project of ours in Queens, in Long Island City, is the Sculpture Center. And the Sculpture Center is kind of in the model of a Kunsthal. It shows contemporary work. It's about a 10-minute walk from MoMA PS1. And the Sculpture Center is located in a building that was originally constructed in 1908 for the repair of trolleys and locomotives. And here you can see that building as we found it. It had been previously very lightly renovated by Maya Lin about 20 years ago. And so she got the Sculpture Center into the building, and then it was our job to kind of bring things forward. On the plan on the left here is the existing as we found it. So the building is really one large space with an empty lot to its left. And then the plan on the right is what we created, which was to build a small 2-story building in the lot on the left, and that this building kind of plugs in, if you will, to the original great space. The large space, of course, was really wonderful for the showing of art, but the Sculpture Center did not have the support spaces necessary to really make for a complete kind of museum or gallery environment. It also did not have any of the kind of sequencing and timing that I think is important for arriving. So we took all these issues into account. Another very important aspect of this project, as you can see in the plan on the left, was to open up and connect to the basement level, which is an incredible series of elongated spaces that were built, very purpose-built for the previous industrial purpose. So the section of the original building on the left and our project on the right, you can see the 2-story addition, how it plugs in both laterally and in section. And this is a photograph of a model that we used during the design process as we were trying to explain the project intention. And what we ultimately projected was this creation of a 16-foot high steel wall, which closes off the adjacent site, the new building, and threads its way behind the masonry facade. And then that wall becomes a gate, which opens daily with the museum. So the entry to the Sculpture Center is through the space between new and old. The gap is marked by the joint between 2 materials, brick and steel. And the architecture is designed in a small space to allow for this kind of slow process of arrival and revealing of both the spaces within, and then more importantly, of the art that will be encountered. This is a view looking from the entry through to the rear sculpture courtyard. We created 2 courtyards as part of this project. And you can view to the upper right into the original building. And in this photograph, can see the original building on the right and the new building on the left. This was taken before we completely finished the project, but it's a good way to see both spaces simultaneously. And the actual Sculpture Center is completely reinvented on a show-by-show basis. So flexibility was part of the overall project design consideration, so that the artists and curatorial teams can reimagine the spaces as the work demands. This is a view looking through the old space into the new. And the opening in the brick wall was cut as part of our project. And so cutting became a way to connect, but also a way to reveal some of the salient original elements, such as this steel pier of the industrial building. Here's a view of the bookshop, small bookshop that we created, space to sit and pause, to read under a skylight. And a part of the overall project intention was very much to expose and to kind of frame aspects of the original architecture that was being excavated. So here's a view in the basement level where you can see a very purpose-built wall of brick, slate, and ceramic, which was there to control the high voltage power that used to thread through those chambers. This is one of the vault spaces in the basement. And these spaces are kind of reimagined, repurposed for site-specific work often. We designed new entry doors for the great space. As you can see here on the exterior, these doors can be opened up for load in, load out, but also to provide a kind of ceremonial connection between the sculpture center and the street, which suits it on festival days. And a view of the project. This is the view one sees as one approaches down the street on the way from the subway or from PS1. And in retrospect, one of the issues that I realized we provided for here was to really carve out, if you will, a bit of a precinct for the original building. This building has, since we did this project, has been encroached upon by just an incredible amount of rapacious development. But it can hold its ground because it has just enough street frontage and presence, I think, to withstand what's come. So this next project is a studio for an artist, a sculptor named Barry X. Ball. And Barry works primarily in stone. Barry has a very complex workflow that starts with photography or digital scans. 3D digital scans involves heavy digital manipulation, heavy machinery, and much fine handwork. We're now in Brooklyn, the borough of Brooklyn. It's just south of Queens. This is a waterfront site. It is a manufacturing site. It's on the East River. The Hudson River is the river to the left of Manhattan. This is still an industrial zone for manufacturing. And it was very important for us to develop an architecture and an urbanism for this project that continues to the enduring character of the manufacturing and making of the area. Here's a view across the street from our site. The neighborhood has a lot of site fences. It feels very cordoned off. And this was a view before our project from a roof on of a building on the site. In the middle ground, you can see the oil tanks, which are on the waterfront of the East River. And on the left, you see the World Trade Center and some of Lower Manhattan. So Barry, our client, purchased 4 lots, a brilliant move. And one of these lots had a brick building on it, a very light, very lightly built brick warehouse that sufficed for a little bit of storage, but really was not strong enough for his needs. And so much of what this project entailed was a very comprehensive and kind of considered structural approach. We worked with Ramon Gilsans and his team to totally underpin and restructure this warehouse and then build out the other 3 lots. So here you can see what we ultimately arrived at in terms of a plan. And the original building has been absorbed into a campus for the making of art. It's a place where Barry and his 12 or so assistants can work together on all phases of the work simultaneously. And it allows for work in the 2 exterior courtyards that were created. In this drawing, you can see the old building in black, onto which we grafted a series of new structures. So the overall strategy here was additive, and that resulted in an assemblage of different elements that make a whole, and this whole becomes very much a part of the streetscape. And this assemblage is both closed and it's open. Most of the local manufacturing buildings are very closed, very fortress-like, and it was important here to create a sense of visual porosity to be able to see in and see much of what was going on. These are the entry doors to the main hall, which were sized to allow for tractor trailers to drive in, and the main workspace, which is daylit, and cranes in and out. And off the workspace are a series of smaller workrooms for grinding, sandblasting, washing, and polishing the pieces. Barry, to his credit, was very mindful of the quality of the spaces, not just for the work, but also for himself and his team, as they spend, of course, long hours doing what they do. The exterior doors can be opened up when the weather is nice. It's a view of 3 assistants working on a project, on a sculpture. This is one of those small workrooms. So it's an opportunity to work with natural light. This building has a lot of wonderful spaces in it. This is one, kind of a place where prototypes are kept. We haven't finished photographing. We were delayed and distracted by recent events, but there are more photographs to get. I've included a few snapshots, such as here, where you can see the stone starting to be accumulated in the courtyard for future work. And this is a view from the roof, where there's a large space, daylit space on the left, and then an opportunity to plant on the right. So again, working with the character of the neighborhood and really extending the vernacular of the utilitarian structures was important, as well as to evidence and share the production quality of the building. So this next project is a small neighborhood library. The client is the New York Public Library. New York City has 3 library systems that have divided up the boroughs. The New York Public Library has responsibility for Manhattan, for the Bronx, and for Staten Island. We're in the Bronx now. The Bronx is the far north extreme of the city, at the end of the subway line. And this particular neighborhood is called Van Cortlandt. It's a very heterogeneous neighborhood, mixed use, housing at different scales, from single family to large apartment blocks. There's, of course, warehouses and industry as well. I think it's long been an immigrant neighborhood, and now it is about 65% Spanish speaking. And the public library purchased this building from a developer. The developer had purchased this building from a bank in foreclosure, and the bank had purchased the building from another bank, and it just kept going down the line. The building had never been occupied. It was built as short-term transitional housing, but a series of economic disasters kept it empty. The public library purchased it because it was in an ideal location for a new branch library for this neighborhood. And they asked us to, with a fast track schedule, renovate it and essentially transform it into not just a suitable library, but into a public library, a public building. And it was my goal really to make something that was urbane here, to take something that was not worthy of the neighborhood and transform it into something that would help lift the neighborhood. The building sits in an excavated depression with raw rock around it, and the geology was suggestive to some extent of a way forward. This is a plan of the building as it was when we came to it, a series of small efficiency apartments off a double-loaded corridor, not even a gesture towards public space. And what we did was completely gut it and imagine it as a series, of course, of public spaces. And on the second floor, we created teen and children's spaces. The new facade is clad in terracotta shingles, and the stratification of the facade to some extent, I think, engages with the geology. The shingles themselves have a certain rhyming quality with the brick, the stone, and the slate of the neighborhood. The spaces are very simple and bright. Here, books line the walls. In this space, we actually raised the roof to get a little bit of semblance of publicly scaled space. The people and the books provide color. And we were able to frame a few very small views, vignettes of the exterior. On the second floor, the children's room, and beside it, a teen space. And with the children's room, we created a series of window bays for seating for two. And this is a view of the entry. And I was just looking at this the other day and realized that this poster on the left is advertising for cooling. It's called for a cooling center. And this, to some, is what the library is. It's a place where you can get air conditioning. In the winter, it's a place where you can get air conditioning in the summer, heating in the winter. About a third of New York City households do not have Wi-Fi, so it is very much a place where people go for Wi-Fi and computer access. And of course, it is still a major distributor of books, digital media, and information. We found in working with the public library that the borrowing of books is actually increasing, much to the, I think, common sense expectations. And this is a view of the library from the street in the evening. The library presenting itself as a public asset with a small courtyard in front of it. It's a modest building, and it's a building that I hope speaks of care, the care we put into it, and more importantly, the care that the library brings to these branch libraries. So the last project I want to show is the New York Public Library's Stapleton branch. Stapleton is in Staten Island. Staten Island is an island across New York Harbor. It is the 5th borough. There is a wonderful ferry ride connecting downtown with Staten Island. It is out there across the harbor. It used to be a waterfront neighborhood. It's still a waterfront neighborhood, but it used to have an active waterfront life with heavy industry and a Navy facility. The Navy and the industry are gone, and it is now very much a multi-use area with both multi-family houses and large housing projects. Many of the buildings are in poor condition. The housing projects speak generally of a lack of public largesse, and there's a sense of kind of dearth of opportunity, I find, out here. The library is on a small park. This is the library when it was built. It was built 112 years ago as part of the Carnegie Grant, which was responsible for many of the public libraries in New York. And this is the building as we found it. It was a one-room neighborhood library. It's overcrowded, insufficient space, but fortunately it was primarily intact. We were given the site next door, an empty lot, to increase the library size, the footprint, fourfold. And concurrent with the design of this project, we undertook a commissioned study of the branch libraries. It was funded in part by the Architectural League of New York. And during this, we chose to study the branch libraries of New York City, which are 207, and to identify what the kind of common programmatic needs of the libraries are, and what and how those needs don't really mesh with the building stock. And the result of the study was to prepare a conceptual and implementable kit of parts to suggest how these libraries could be adapted on an as-needed and resource-available basis. And this study has very much become not just an ongoing part of our practice, but I would say a part of how we strategically think about the disused and overburdened buildings that we often have to work with. So by the end of this process, we simplified the plan to its essence. I show this model because we work heavily in models. And we often just photograph the models in lieu of renderings. Here you can see the neoclassical building on the right and the new structure on the left. The new structure is out of glue laminated timbers. This was an architectural decision, but very much also a strategic decision. It allowed us to build off-site under a controlled environment to elude low bid contractor conditions. And the wood becomes an expression of the library, expression of the architecture, and a way to knit old and new together. And the library is now one grand public space under a unifying wood roof. Natural light fills the space. This is the central core of the library. The core contains the community room, as well as service and mechanical. And it acts to help both separate and connect the spaces under the roof. And this space is reimagined as needed during the course of the day. This is children's room. So the original Carnegie Library was given over to the children to make a grand space for the living. And the library, as seen from the sidewalk, very evidently a public resource for the neighborhood. So in mid-February, we went out to the public library to check in. It was a very quiet day, but I asked people what they were thinking and doing. Find it really valuable to see how people use the spaces that we make. And I often wonder if and how our projects are able to speak on the long term.
Well, I appreciate you keeping this space in its original form, because it just adds, some character and some historic value to the atmosphere. All the light that pours in, it's like sunny all the time, even on a cloudy day.
It's always bright. There is so many kids here. And for us, library, it's always a good idea.
The way it's set up, nice and warm in here, cozy, very quiet, as libraries should be.
I always come, to the library to do my, my assignments, my projects. I feel relaxed, it makes me to concentrate, to focus on what I'm studying,
We get a lot of people who come in here who haven't been in here since the building was extended, and they're blown away by it. They tell us stories about how they remember when that was just a children's room, and then they look around and they really admire the beauty of the space. We tend to think of a library as being somewhat like a school, but sometimes it's actually more like a public park, in that it's like you go somewhere and you learn how to share the space, and everybody's equal in here.
It felt majestic, and now it's got even more of a contemporary feel to it, I think. It's taking the neighborhood in a different direction as well. I think it's one of those places that brings the community together. It has a purpose, but it also has the room to create its own purpose, for us to create our own things.
And so I would like to end with that little video. Let the people of Stapleton and the library have the last word. And I really thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the 100 Day Studio.
Andrew, thank you so much. Could you perhaps, if you unshare your screen, and then we can see you full on, as it were, and then if people have questions, we've got a few minutes left. If you have things you'd like to ask Andrew, then just let me know in the chat box. But Andrew, I'd be really interested just to hear a little more about your journey to independent practice. It feels the work's extraordinarily beautiful and distinctive, but it also feels quite unusual within the context of American practice today. And I wondered who many of your references were to artists and maybe to vernacular buildings, maybe, but perhaps less so to the culture of high US architecture of recent decades. How do you situate yourself within that territory?
Well, it's a hard question, Ellis. I don't have perhaps enough perspective, but one of the beauties and joys of architecture for me is to look beyond, outside of my immediate confines. And when I look around, of course, which is the grist of every project, I see what I need. But I can look around and I can see, great work being done across the world and across time, and have found that very nourishing, very, very nourishing for myself. And feel that I've been able to, in a way, keep a bit of a distance from some of the kind of tropes and habits of what might be happening closer to home. I've had a great series of work experiences, and I could call them mentors. I worked in Chicago for several years for a very talented and rigorous Miesian architect who had a kind of postmodern meltdown. And I was there. When I was hired, I thought I was going into a Miesian office, and when I left, I knew where it was. But I had a remarkable experience because the commitment to rigor and construction was great. And this was my dean at Yale. And Tom was a very, very smart critic. I had a great working experience with Deborah Burke in New York City. And Deborah had a kind of brilliant understatement to her work. And that was very opening to me. It really helped to see that one could do something with a kind of light hand, an apparent light hand. And I have to say, increasingly been aware of the fact that Stan Allen, I don't know if you know Stan Allen shared a desk then, and then Stan and I shared a studio for a while afterwards. And just watching Stan has been an incredible inspiration. The way he draws, he looks, he's just such a thinking, making, kind of full picture creative person. And I've had lots of great chance encounters. Tony mentioned that we met in Mantova last year, but I met Tony sometime around, I don't know, the mid-90s, when I picked up, without knowing his name or his work, a little monograph of his, and that proved to be just like an enormously instructive and kind of motivating encounter. So, I'm always looking abroad. I find Europe is nourishing, not just for the architectural design, but the sense of kind of a shared public civic space that still endures. And, America doesn't have that same history. And I think, I hope that I conveyed that one of my concerns is to help kind of work into the public space, make buildings less isolated objects.
Yeah, I mean, from the other side of the Atlantic, it sometimes feels like cultural buildings in the US are the preserve of quite a limited pool of predominantly European practices. Is that fair to say? That, I mean, not exclusively so, but yeah, we could probably reel off a list of kind of 10 to 20 sort of names who were the recipients of the major sort of cultural commissions in the US, many of whom are not of American origin. Is that a, yeah, you're clearly a very skillful architect working in the cultural field. Do you find that that's, how do you observe that situation?
Well, there's absolutely a kind of short list of usual suspects who get a kind of outsized number of commissions. Many of them are very obviously talented and making good work, but I think there is a kind of, it leads to a little bit of a vacuum in the opportunities that some of these projects can yield if more local talent was tapped. As you go around the country and dig deeper, you do find, of course, practitioners who are getting smaller, not lesser important, but smaller commissions. They're doing remarkable work. But yeah, a lot of these big name imports are kind of taking up a lot of the funds and the attention. Absolutely.
It feels like you clearly have a lot of clients and friends who are artists. I sense that have those dialogues been useful ones for you in sort of formulating your position as an architect?
Absolutely, invaluable. It's just, it's sort of a kind of treasured experience to be able to work with good clients, period. They don't have to be artists to be good clients. And I've been fortunate to work with a lot of wonderful clients. But the artists, each carry their kind of own world and way of thinking with them in a very kind of mature, articulated way. That's part of their agenda. And so kind of understanding their world, understanding how they see is very interesting. And one of the things that I've observed is that I've always expected artists and photographers to kind of have the tools of an architect and have their own tools. But what I've seen is that, they have their tools and their expertise, and part of my responsibility is to engage with them and understand what it is they really need to be in their place, and let the architecture kind of let their work go further. But I've worked with photographers, movie makers, Barry, some painters. And it's all been very, very kind of interesting, productive, and enjoyable. Yeah. And I have to say that I feel that part of the opportunity of living in New York City is that you live in a world which is overlaid with art, if you are attuned to it. There's this, not just a history of art, but a contemporary making of art. I'm sure London is the same in many respects. And if one's attuned to it and is aware of what's going on, it is very nourishing.
Andrew, we've got a question from Nick Walker. Nick, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to attempt to unmute you.
There you go. I think that's worked this time. Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. It was a question really about the difference between new build and renovation. One of the things we're beginning to discover is that even the buildings that are built today are going to have to be retrofitted to deal with climate change. So the future of architecture is reusing existing buildings. And I suppose a lot of existing buildings, no matter how unassuming they might be, create a sense of place and a part of a context, and they can be quite important to residents. So how do you feel about working on renovations and repurposing of building as projects compared to new build? Does it give you a greater sense of reward? Or is it not that simple?
I find reward in both, absolutely. And engaging with existing buildings that have something strong in and of themselves is extremely rewarding. PS1 with strong physical environment, incredible kind of collective cultural environment. I could say that about the Sculpture Center. The more difficult buildings to engage with, as you say, are the new buildings. And we do this as well. And it's phenomenally difficult because the new buildings are never actually finished. They're kind of handed over before they get to that point of being waterproof and fully functioning. And so one is kind of walking into usually a kind of ill-formed environment that is laden with problems. But I think it's just kind of part of our ongoing project to be able to tackle it, take it head on, and hopefully transform it into something kind of suitably, I don't know, noble, for lack of a better word. And I think that was part of the agenda at hand for the library in the Bronx in Van Cortlandt, right? This building really had a certain disappointing quality when we found it, very disappointing quality. But at the end of the day, the transformation happened, and it's something that I think the neighborhood and the library can be proud of. I can be proud of.
We have a strange tax regime in the UK whereby existing buildings you have to pay tax on, but new buildings you don't. So there's already a 20% cost implication from renovating existing building, which just seems completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
You don't have anything similar to that in the States. It's not loaded that way, or.
I don't know very much about the dark art of accounting and how it works, but I think new construction receives a disproportionate amount of economic support, and it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. I think we as architects, definitely in New York, the growth industry in the future is just trying to take care of the crumbling new buildings. That's where somebody wants to go if they just want to be busy. But I think our task is to try to make something of everything that we encounter, and hope to be able to do it before the urbanism of New York is kind of eroded by zoning changes, which are happening quickly.